All right. So welcome all to our panel, Ask a Scientist, Medical Professionals. My name is Dluzen. I'll be your moderator today. And welcome. Thanks for attending. I'll ask each panelist in a moment just to introduce themselves and give a brief background of their experience and training related to their fields. And just a little housekeeping that at the moment, attendees, you're muted. And the way we're going to work this is if you have a question, the bottom of your screen, you should see a little Q&A button. Feel free to open that up and type your question in. That will prompt it to me, and then I'll be able to read out the question and deliver it to either the entire panel or if there's a specific person that you have a question for. And then they'll be able to answer. I'll also be monitoring the webinar chat button in case any questions slip in there, but try and get it into the question and answer field. I am an assistant professor of biology at Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland. I'm a geneticist, and I study health disparities in the city. And let's begin. And so we'll start with Dr. Gandalf, and then we'll go to Dr. Macko, and then Kim, the comic book goddess. And if you could just give a brief background of your training, your experience, and then just to get the ball rolling, an example that you find of great medicine in speculative fiction.
Okay, I'm Eric Fleischer. I'm a recently retired ophthalmologist after 42 years of practice. I'm also an assistant clinical professor of ophthalmology at Georgetown University and Washington Hospital Center. I've spent my career partly seeing patients and partly teaching residents, which has been a very rewarding thing. What was the other question?
A great example or an example you like of medicine in speculative fiction. It could be a movie, book, something you find that was great or well done. Or you can think on it and come back to it.
I'll think on it. Let me think on it.
Richard?
Well, I want to say that I've led a deprived childhood because this is my first Balticon. And now the world is opening up to me in ways that it's never been before. I'm looking for collaborators to be a content advisor. And what is my content? I'm a neurologist, a professor of neurology and medicine and of physical therapy and rehabilitation medicine, 3 departments at University of Maryland School of Medicine. I'm associate director of research and a geriatrics research education and clinical center. And for over 20 years, I've been studying brain plasticity to help individuals that have CNS injuries and focusing on robotics in ways to teach people to recover after a stroke, not to be an assistive device, but a therapeutic device. And I'm inspired by Isaac Asimov's 3 robotic laws. At noon, I'll be talking about how those 3 robotic laws apply to neurological robotics rehabilitation for stroke.
Very cool. And Dr. Kim?
Definitely not a doctor. I'm actually the ground level. After a bunch of years in tech, I had a change in my life, and I decided to go into emergency medical services. Awesome. And I've been Balticon panelist presenter. I actually play the music track for I think 10 years now. Awesome. And I CPR. I'm a CPR instructor. Everybody messes up CPR. Again, so I'm an emergency medical technician. That's pretty much one step above the absolute lowest of the low. I'm an ambulance driver. I work full time. I have certifications in hazardous materials operation, firefighter 1, and I'm a CPR instructor. Probably, you know what? I think Flowers for Algernon is one of those test works that kind of shows the ways that you can use medicine in science fiction to make a point. Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, great. Well, thank you all. So again, if any of you out there watching have any questions, just type them into the Q&A and I'll forward them along. So don't be shy, don't be bashful. And while we wait for you to all chip in, how about an example of science done incorrectly or medicine done incorrectly in one of your favorite movies or books?
Well, I always love the way that they screw up science in Wizarding World, even in the Harry Potter thing. They come up with magical ways of curing things. I always wonder, where does the power for magic come from? Energy has to come from somewhere. And if you're healing someone and making things in their bodies change, you have to be using up some of your own energy. My only explanation for that was when you see the scenes in the Great Hall and they have all these tables stacked high with food, and they're all gorging themselves on all this high calorie food, but they still don't get fat. That must be where the energy comes from.
Well, I know that chocolate heals in Harry Potter, and I wish that were the case in real life.
It is, isn't it?
Emotionally, yes. Richard or Kim, any comments?
Well, I'll give a very brief comment that there's a movie with Sutherland that I believe that has medical students playing around with making themselves die temporarily, and the experience that they have coming back from that. And I want to share with Kim, the comic book goddess, that absolutely does not work that way. When you go under and you have reduced oxygen to the brain called hypoxemia, and you don't have somebody doing CPR correctly, you see people like me. And I tell you, whether you're going into a persistent vegetative state, which really sucks, or else you're going toward brain death and your family needs to decide whether you need to donate your organs. So all of those movies are bunk.
Absolutely. I didn't see Flatliners. I think I knew.
I would not recommend to do that at home.
Oh dear. Although Stitchers, I didn't mind Stitchers. But there isn't a lot of, the actual dying and bringing them back doesn't happen in Stitchers. They're already dead. You go into their brains. Well, apparently their neurons are still in pieces, but pretty much every author that wants a cheap way to get drama has their character die and bring him back, and they shock asystole.
Can you explain a little bit what you mean by that?
Okay, so when a patient has actually flatlined, it is not one of the things that jump starting their heart can actually does something with. I mean, in generally speaking, there's other types of cardiac arrhythmias that the big old reset button would do. But if you stick an AED on there and there's no electrical activity, that machine's just going to tell you to keep doing CPR.
There's a reason why that machine is called a defibrillator, not a wake up from flatliner.
Yeah, and the text behind that is you can't make dead meat beat.
Excellent.
Yeah, I do. Something that's specific to me as an ophthalmologist. I've seen so many movies where the baddies need to get a sample of genetic material, and they decide they want to get it from the patient's vitreous in their eye, and they do it by sticking a needle straight through their cornea, straight through their crystalline lens, and into the vitreous. Well, that ain't going to happen. For one thing, if you stick a needle into the lens, you're just going to knock it loose, and you're going to have a cataract instantly from it. But we have ways. I mean, we do actually surgically get stuff out of the vitreous, but we don't go that way. And it's just so silly to go straight. See, I think they're going for exactly what Kim is doing now. That's what they're going for. They want people to have that reaction.
No. Actually, the reason why I had that reaction, doctor, that happened to my brother. Actually, he accidentally stuck a needle into his cornea and gave himself a cataract. Yeah.
Yep.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that's a thing that's actually happened. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Oh no, he's had an artificial lens for 20 years now, but
yeah.
it's
that sort of thing happens all the time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's a lot of. I've seen many a patient who said, "I shouldn't have done that thing that I did."
Well, we have a couple questions coming in. The first one, I believe, is open for the panel for anyone to answer. And the question is the Larry Niven idea of organ transplants from criminals plausible?
Plausible, yes. Morally justifiable is a different question entirely.
Yes, I would agree with that if once we understand the genetic and histocompatibility of the organs from criminals, that biologically could work. But ethically, you have to hope that they're already brain dead and they've made a wish ahead of time on their Maryland or whatever card, driver's license, that says, I am an organ donor. I agree to this.
It'd be a pulsed in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Order for Life-Sustaining Treatment.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
All right. Excellent. And we have another question coming in for Dr. Gandalf. What are your thoughts on Honor Harrington's prosthetic eye? And do you think we'll do that anytime in the near future?
I don't know that specific prosthetic eye, but there are a lot of work. There's a lot of work going on right now for ocular prostheses, particularly for people who have things like retinitis pigmentosa and such. There are two different ways they have of getting the visual information into the brain. One is to put an electronic stimulation sheet into the eye over the retina and then hook it up to some kind of a video camera, which they've done, and they've actually made it work. But the trouble is that it's like a 5x7 pixel image that the patient sees, which is something, but not great. And the other thing is retinal cells in the neuroretinal cells are not made to be stimulated by outside electricity, and they eventually get fried. So it really doesn't work for the long term. The other possibility that's being worked on, which probably has more promise, is to put a sheet of electrical stimulators over the occipital cortex, because the visual processing for the brain is back here. And if you put a sheet of these things in, you can actually make the patient see an image. And that has been done also, and people are working on that. It is not something that's going to be working real well in the very near future, but in the long future, it might. Waking up eyeballs that are dead is never going to happen. Transplanting whole eyeballs is never going to happen. Each optic nerve has about 1.25 million nerves in it. There's no way you're going to attach them back up.
I think what Gandalf, you're talking about with the stimulation of the cortex is a form of brain machine interface. And individuals that have complete paralysis from neurological disorders, there are ways to connect, or partial paralysis, to connect the nervous system or proximal portions of the body that work to a distant part of the organ. And when you're talking about the eyes, you're talking here about taking sensory information and delivering it into the brain. So it's the sort of opposite pathway. It's incoming sensory information going to the brain, while brain-machine interfaces, which really could have been used more in science fiction, go from the nervous system out for neuromotor control.
Excellent. Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, especially considering that we actually already have testing of long distance neural interface. They have done some testing where people on different continents have they've sent the impulses to have someone move their arm from one continent to the other. That is actual, somebody's working on it right now, science.
That's amazing. That kind of like manipulation, but also that connectivity that goes on between, especially over a long distance.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have a couple questions coming in. One is just a comment that here in the UK, so awesome that we have some audience members all the way across the pond, so welcome. And in the UK, in reference to a previous question, that they have changed to make the default in agreement with donation. So just a point of interest. Thank you for sharing that about organ donation. We have okay. This comment is I see a lot. I see a lot of films and TV shows. This would be open for everyone on the panel, and all questions are obviously, but just a general open where people get knocked out, which I believe is a concussion of some sort. But what is the short or the long-term realities of being hit so hard on the head, particularly when you go unconscious, especially if the protagonist has this happen multiple times a season?
Can I go at this first, and then the people,
Yeah.
and then our lovely neurologist who's going to be able to give the real terms for some of the things that are going. One of the things that you rarely tend to see going right in speculative fiction is the immediate after effects of a concussion. In term, and I'm talking about one that is not quite so bad that you end up bleeding into the brain, stroking out, and dying, which is definitely something that can happen, and we would be looking for almost immediately. A classic concussion syndrome, again, from my end of things, generally speaking, it takes about as long as it takes me to get to the scene on a rural motor vehicle accident for someone to start displaying concussion symptoms. And the big symptom is repetitive questioning, because as their brain swells, one of the first things they forget is what just happened, up to and including the accident. So well, okay, I'm an EMT, so I'd be driving the paramedic in the back, but I would hear the exact same question go off every 2 minutes with the exact same answer from the paramedic, the exact same reaction to that answer. Maybe once in a while, the person with the concussion would notice something new, which would change the pattern, but there is definitely a pattern. I also want to toss into that. I gave a paramedic a concussion once, and it was exactly the wrong paramedic to give a concussion to. We had a very sick patient in the back. I took the wrong road. I didn't see the pothole. And the paramedic was very tall and wedged up under the shelf in the back, and it hit him. It hit him in the head. And there was about 30 seconds of no sound. And he's a very big, and you don't want to anger him guy. So when he didn't want to stop and let me look at him, in my judgment, it was best not to. I called my supervisor. Everybody met up at the hospital, but he is an extraordinary man. He actually kept everything together, and I was listening because I'd been monitoring the entire call. The report that he gave to the doctors was absolutely perfect. And he finished, and I said, and now you need to get examined. And all of the ER staff looked at me kind of like I was crazy. Immediately, like drop of a hat, concussion syndrome set in. He started asking, wait, what did we hit? What happened? And in the repetitive questioning, everything exactly. My supervisor showed up just on time. But there appears to be, at least from my single anecdotal evidence, that there is a little bit of either luck or the will of the person might be able to affect it slightly. But eventually what you're getting is that same concussion syndrome. Also, before I toss it to the guy who really, really knows, from some people that I've known, you've got to think of that syndrome where as they get more concussions, they get worse. And that can be very apparent too in the way that you write about it if you are doing it correctly.
Mm-hmm.
So, Kim, I want to thank you. That's a very, very compelling and accurate description of what happens with traumatic brain injury when you're seeing it live. And it's a very, very scary and devastating event. And I have to tell you that I'm privileged to be able to help take care of veterans and many people that have had traumatic brain injury, which we've learned so much about over the past, since the Gulf War, where the body is more protected by shielding, and appendicular arm and leg injuries and traumatic brain injuries become the predominant factors. And sometimes I've heard up to 20% of soldiers come back with these symptoms. And what I think you're describing is the acute effect of anterograde and retrograde memory problems, where anterograde means you're not processing memories forward for a block of time. And retrograde means you lose your memories for a certain amount of time. So oftentimes people don't even know what happened to them, but they know something happened, but their bell was rung. And this can happen even if you don't have a complete loss of consciousness. This is one of the things that we've learned about traumatic brain injury, is you can have no loss of consciousness and have traumatic brain injury that creates oftentimes a durable effect. And repetitive ones hurt even more. They hurt the brain even more, and they add up. And the syndrome that you start to get out of the immediate impact is a post-concussive syndrome. And this is going to include headaches. You can have ringing in your ears. There can be traumatic brain injury disturbances of sleep. There can be impairments of mood. And what you could call the Achilles heel of cognitive function is executive function, your attention, your concentration, your ability to dual task. All of these aspects of executive control of your brain, along with the memory, get screwed up. And sometimes that can last for a very long time. And in terms of the neurons, what's happening with more severe cases, you have diffuse axonal injury, which means the long cables of the nervous system get sheared because of the forces that occur. They shear the brain on the axons, and this diffuse axonal injury adds up to brain damage that's persistent. Then when we get into the real severe cases, these shearing injuries lead to bleeds in the brain. And we see these, at University of Maryland shock trauma. You see them often. You're talking about very, very serious injuries and brain swelling that can come along with it. But the story is that you can recover with it. There's hope that you can recover. Even many years out, we see people with traumatic brain injury, oftentimes with post-traumatic stress disorder that goes along with it, that fight back at it and can regain control, because the brain does have plasticity. It has an amazing resilience and ability to recover, but it can be battles. I've seen battles for years before people come back.
Great, thank you. We have that is really fascinating that plasticity can allow an injured brain like that to reorganize, which is any of that driven by like stem cells in the brain that regenerate anything, or is it just the ability to rewire?
Well, that's a really good question. For many years, we didn't think that the central nervous system had the capacity to regenerate. Then animal studies working with rodents found certain regions of the brain have high levels of plasticity, and they actually do create new cells. And subsequently, it's been shown that in the human, areas of the brain, hippocampal, dentate gyrus, sections of the brain that have higher levels of plasticity do have the capacity to regenerate. And there's a little question that after a traumatic brain injury, an inflammatory process is set up, which fights against plasticity and regeneration. And when the brain's factors, growth factors like brain-derived neurotrophic factors and a host of other growth factors kick into gear, they can stimulate plasticity and reorganization of pre-existing cells, and some new cells can be made. Yes, and that's probably part of the plasticity of pre-existing cells and reorganization of the neurons is probably the major healing effect. But there are new cells that can be made in the central nervous system, and that's something I think that science fiction should leverage, because that could go a small amount or a large amount. You could do things with that in the capability of human consciousness.
Excellent. Thank you. Kim, you mentioned you had a comment about long-term TBI.
Yes. I've have several friends and have had coworkers that had persistent traumatic brain injury, and at least one of them with rehab has such great coping skills that you'd never know that they had it. But yeah, there's several, and uh, there's several that have persistent, like midterm memory issues where you have to answer the same questions for them over and over again. It takes an extraordinarily long time for them to retain the new information.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, we got some great questions coming in from the audience. Dr. Gandalf, I'll have you take just the first stab at this one. Does a person have to have a medical degree to do medical research?
Obviously not, because you're a medical researcher and you don't have a medical degree.
Yes.
No, actually, a fair portion of medical researchers are PhD or master's people, not necessarily MDs. No, you don't have to. The only thing you need to be a medical doctor for is to treat patients, but to treat research, no. And there are many, many, many fine researchers that are not medical doctors.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. And let's see here. I'm going to hit on this one. Okay. I'm trying to get these in order that they're coming in.
But Doug, I wanted to just add to that. It's that ideas drive research. It's novel ideas, and anybody can have those ideas. You can have a middle school student that sees something without our biases that comes up with an idea. And so really the generation of ideas and asking questions in medical research is the driving factor. And I think that sometimes we see those things coming out of people that don't even have medical training, that have just fresh ideas without blinders.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
It may actually help in a lot of cases.
Yeah. All right, we have a question from the audience of which movie or TV show seems to get the medical science right more often than not?
I'm just going to chip in very briefly on that House has investigative capacities to consider a differential diagnosis, which is realistic in most cases, dramatic in all cases, and oftentimes comes up with some esoteric findings, which for the most case I've found are medically accurate.
That's interesting because we watched the first 3 or 4 episodes of House when it first came out, and I found his medical knowledge and his medical technique so wildly inaccurate and awful that we gave up watching it. He tended to hunt down zebras rather than look for common things. He would give somebody a treatment that takes days or weeks to have an effect, and if it hasn't cured the patient in hours, he would try something else. And we gave up on watching the show because of that. Maybe it got better after we quit.
I recall at least one, and I only watched the later seasons. We actually sat down and watched it at the station, and me and my partner were watching one episode, and House is dressing down a paramedic, and he said, "Well, I guess they don't teach that in paramedic school." Cue unison. Yes, they do. But actually, at least for my industry, amusingly enough, they usually go back to Emergency in the 1970s in terms of an actually accurate, to the time, emergency medicine show. But currently, in my own personal silly opinion, Sirens was actually the most recent one that was at least that was. That was most like a day on the ambulance, really. With the exception of every once in a while, they still did get something wrong. I mean, they in order to frame the scene right, they had them lift into the stretcher. They had the patient in the middle of the stretcher, showing the stretcher going to the back of the ambulance, and the 2 EMTs on either side of the stretcher. They wouldn't have even been able to activate the button to let the wheels up. So I don't know.
Excellent.
but real life is sometimes as inaccurate. If you go into Olympic footage, there's at least one accident in the diving pool where apparently people who don't usually work in EMS pulled rank to be able to watch the event, and they put them on the stretcher upside down, like
So
with their head where their feet should go.
I want to adapt my House comments after listening to Gandalf. House is driven by signs and symptoms. And over a very short period of one single session, they have to flip through 5 or 6 different diagnoses, which is what creates the tension. The therapeutics is often off base, and the timing from it is not correct. But the diagnostic symptoms and signs, which create the jigsaw puzzle and the shifting of diagnoses, oftentimes do hold true to the esoteric zebras that they hunt for.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Okay, so a couple great questions. Another one here. We're going to move off planet now. I'd love to hear thoughts from the panel of long-term health effects in zero G, and if fake gravity with centrifugal force is just as good as actual gravity. Who wants to tackle this one?
Well, certainly there were some interesting studies, which I don't recall all the details of the twins, where one spent a year up in the ISS and the other was on the ground. And there was changes in height, there was changes in spacing between vertebrae. More toward my end of the deal, there was a change in the physical shape of the eyeball of the guy that was up, and changes in the structure of the retina. So he actually had visual degradation from having spent the year up in the ISS.
There were some major immune changes too, if I recall correctly, from the preliminary.
Yeah, I'll jump in and say, I know from the genetics angle, the telomeres, which are the caps of our chromosomes in our cells, as we age, they get shorter over time, and it allows for a lot of problems in the regulation of our genes as we get older. And then it showed that the telomeres actually got longer in space. And then when the twin, I think it was Mark, came back to Earth, the telomeres re-shortened again about 6 months after being back on gravity.
Back to where they would have been if he hadn't gone up?
Presumably.
So I want to add to Douglas that telomeres and their length are positively related to cognitive function. And it probably has something to do with the capacity as a geneticist that you would know of generating new neurons and neuroplasticity, because the greater the telomere length, the greater your capacity for healing and regeneration. So that becomes interesting to find out what happens to the brain's function and cognitive function, which I'm not less aware of. What I am aware of is that the reduced gravity circumstance creates major changes in the muscles and the bones. There's a thinning of bone density, which can become very dangerous. And there's a loss of muscle mass, which has to be countered with forces that go across the joint. So NASA has been working with Biodex Corporation, which is a company that we've become affiliated with through our Next Step Robotics. And they've started to take some of the tools they've used in physical therapy for measuring and training strength across the leg joints and converting those into instruments that can be used in space to counter the zero gravity, to retrain the musculature, where you lose fast twitch muscle mass, and bone density, to be able to create a measurement and a treatment device that can be used in space that's extremely lightweight, that hooks right into the pre-existing chairs that might go on to the spaceships.
I'd like to follow up on this question for you, Kim. I'm only guessing, but I'm sure you've seen a fair amount of different types of traumas and things in your work in EMS. Do you think that there are any certain types of injuries that occur frequently, say on Earth, that if they were to happen in space would present, or even just the emergency fix would be different in microgravity?
Well, yeah, because a lot of fixes for or immediate aid for things like fractures becomes a lot more. It becomes a lot more difficult when gravity isn't there, causing everything to fall in the same direction. Yeah, boy.
Has anyone in space ever fractured a bone?
I don't know.
No, I haven't done that research.
I'd be curious how we bleed in space too. If we have a big cut or something like that.
It would bleed in
out,
globules. It's the same thing with the surface tension. There's actually some kids experiments with the astronauts showing you what does happen when you use a towel in space. So once they've got that mass that can break away from the skin, it's going to be a globule of moisture, just like anything else. Now, the clotting might actually be different. I do know that they've done some experiments on it, but I'm not read up directly on them.
So Kim, help me with this. But one thing that we do when we have people that start to bleed, become hypotensive due to dehydration or any sort of a problem, where their blood volume is low, is we put them in Trendelenburg, which is feet up, head down, to increase venous return to the heart and try and keep their circulation going. That's impossible in space because you're in a zero gravity environment. And so here you would have to use some of the approaches that the military has used and first responders in traumatic circumstances where they may end up having to go to compressive bodysuits. And some of those things might need to be inbuilt if somebody's in a hazardous circumstance to be able to compress appropriately. And there are also ways that you could place tourniquets alternatively over the limbs and rotate those to maintain tissue viability, yet reduce the need to supply blood to large appendicular areas like the legs. And those kinds of techniques could help keep somebody alive. I just wanted to bring these up as possibilities.
But actually, pneumatic compression garments were at one point ambulance equipment. They were in and out before I started 10 years ago. They were, but they are something that we have. I can only assume that the science came back on them and they weren't helping quite as much as they thought. One thing to note though is that even though Trendelenburg position is of less use in zero gravity, that's because zero gravity already allows the blood to collect further in the center of your body.
Okay.
You know what I mean? You don't have gravity pulling that away from your heart either. There was another part of that question that I wanted to mention because once upon a time, baby Kim would not have gone into medicine at all. She would have went into nuclear physics. And the question really is, what is the nature of gravity? You have to answer that definitively in order to say whether or not centrifugal force is going to have a different effect on the body. Is the body just reacting to that pressure in one direction, or is there something intrinsic about the nature of the particles involved in actual gravity that is different than momentum? And we don't know that yet. We don't have a unified field theory yet. So we predicted most of those particles, but there are things we still don't know about that. And the only way we're going to be able to establish it one way or another is to actually do the science and send more people into zero gravity.
Well, have to create a spaceship that has the centrifugal gravity force to see what happens.
And one of the points from an engineering perspective, having spent many years working on robotics for people with neurological disease and different types of conditions, that the engineering models can be made that mathematically evolve in a dynamic fashion the sorts of forces that would occur in a certain gravitational environment. And mechanical engineering could apply forces with actuators or variable resistance, such as piezo resistance materials, on a person. And with the concept that machine learning can look at that individual person and calibrate those with feedback, it's completely possible that suits could be made that mitigate the effects of anti-gravity to a great degree, at least on the musculoskeletal system.
Douglas, you're on the space station. Tell us what effect it's had on you.
Yes, can you see? I'm isolating. All the others are in the other part of the cabin right now. The twin study I think is really fascinating because you have two people that are genetically similar, have had similar education, have similar experiences being from the same family, similar training because they're both astronauts. It's such a unique, one of a kind in the world study, looking at sending one of the brothers up into space for a year and coming back. And some of the things too that really piqued my mind, Kim had mentioned the immune system, is that there was activation of several different types of white blood cells, macrophages in particular, that are good at finding the microbes that get in there and cause problems and kind of clearing them out. Dr. Gandalf, you had mentioned just he came back a couple inches taller than his brother, as kind of everything kind of separated out. And then when back on space, he shrunk back down to his normal height within a couple weeks. It was pretty quick. They're still analyzing some of the data to see that like gene expression in those cells is very different from ground control, and how that's going to play into inflammation, into immunity. So needing to take like vaccines in space or exposures to something new. I think a lot of that data will come out in a couple of years just to really see like how effective our cells will be at fighting anything that's infectious up there. Just trying to get through a couple more questions. Okay, here's an interesting one. This one was from a while ago. We have a writer in the group, and she asked if a character needs a significant quantity of their own blood for a ritual. So I'm assuming blood magic here. Where would they cut to minimize their risk of death or long-term damage? So I'm assuming that this is a character that might be having to, take some of their own blood, for instance, for this to work. And so any thoughts on that?
Why is she cutting instead of getting herself an IV and self-donating?
Could be, yes.
That's
Would make a lot more sense.
Yeah.
So perhaps a donation. We'll go to the next question. Let's see here. How much does internal politics affect current medical practices?
Well, that's a really politically charged question.
Yes.
And so one of the things that I would say and give an example is, and Gandalf, you could share this with me too. I've, for 25 years, been taking care of individuals with infectious diseases. When I was at El Hospital Generales, University of Southern California, we had strange infectious diseases come in from all over Central and South America. We knew that you used protective equipment, including masks, long before the CDC and the government came around to that. And I think that the PPE decision was made to try and help protect first-line providers. And the switch to putting masks on everybody for COVID, that's definitely something that helps reduce the spread. It will reduce the distance that you can vaporize, viral materials. But I think that some of those decisions were politically driven, and they helped drive differences between the parties in the United States. But for 25 years, we all know that masks should be worn and help provide some protection and absolutely reduce spreading. So these sorts of things create political party divides, which don't go with 25 years of my experience taking care of people with infectious disease.
Thank you, Richard. Dr. Gandalf or Kim, any thoughts?
Certainly governmental regulation affects pretty much everything we do in medicine. I think a lot of governmental regulation and other things affect whether we order tests, whether we don't order tests. Are we going to get paid for them? Are we afraid that we might get sued if we don't order a test, that someone might later say we should have ordered a test? All those things definitely affect your decisions.
In general, anytime when you've got something other than the good of the patient really, really driving the answer to the question, you are going to get some wonky answers. Now, with that said, I mean, you're going to have limited resources in any case, okay? And part of the difficult decisions is applying them appropriately to the situation. And, you know, after 9/11, in terms of EMS, that's where the incident command system has popped up. And the modules in incident command system, if you're interested in adding a dimension of how are they actually supposed to be handling it on the ground? It's not the same thing as how did they actually do it, but it should be close in a well-run area. The incident command system, many of the modules are available. They're online training. There are certain ones that are in-person classes, but somebody thought about it and gave a framework where the person whose weight is supposed to count in the situation is already defined. First person on the scene until an officer from the area having jurisdiction shows up, and then they can take over the scene. You know, there's still internal politics problems. I mean, it happens in everything, but some places are better than others. There are. There is in this. If as we're talking about COVID-19, there are definitely groups, facilities, companies that are running better than others. I mean, there's inequity of resources as well. Not everybody has the same ability to secure what they need, but there are definitely people that are using things better than others.
Thank you. We just have a minute here. And first I want to say thank you to everyone in attendance and all your great questions. I'm sorry that we didn't get to all the questions, but I would also like to thank the panelists. And if we could just do a quick round, we'll go from Dr. Gandalf to Richard to Kim. Is there any one quick topic or quick thoughts you had that we didn't touch on today that you were eager to talk about and can maybe point people here that are interested in following up in the right direction towards that?
Not really. Actually, I had a couple of bugaboos that always bug me about stuff, and we covered them.
Excellent. Rich?
Yes. As a person that's interested in the nervous system and aging, which we all do, and thinking about the future of what happens to the brain in space, I think we need to understand Alzheimer's disease, cerebrovascular disease, and how cognitive function and brain health is influenced being in space, because when we go out there, we're going to have to deal with the same types of problems that we're dealing when we get older here in the world. And that's something that I think is a great unknown.
Thank you. And Kim?
The thought that I had just flew out of my head. I should probably see Dr. Macko there.
No problem. Well, I think I'm sorry, go ahead.
One thing. For those of you who do include accidents in your work, there actually is a pretty good Facebook group called Trauma Fiction, where everybody who has time kind of looks at it and tries to answer other people's questions about medical science involving your plot. Sometimes better than others, you know, sometimes the questions are better than others, but it's definitely something worth looking at.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for your time, and thank you, panelists, for all coming and with your great questions, and hope you have a safe and really exciting rest of the virtual Balticon.
For everybody, we have a channel over on Discord under Discord Baltimore Sci-Fi, where you can have post-panel chats if people wish to go over there. Also, remember that it does cost us something to put all this stuff on. If you go to balticon.org and click on the GoFundMe link, we'd appreciate any links, any contributions that anybody has. Thank you for attending.